Welcome to SR Studios Inside the Issue. Today's guest is Mark Labowskie, whose story Attachments is featured in the fall 2025 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Mark Labowskie is a Jones Lecturer in the Creative Writing Program at Stanford University, where he was previously a Wallace Stegner Fellow. His stories have appeared in the Missouri Review, ZYZZYVA, American Short Fiction, and elsewhere. Mark, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for
Hi.
having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So could you maybe start us off by reading a bit from your story Attachments?
Sure. I will read the first page or two.
Great.
When I was growing up, my mother hosted community salons in our front yard and continued to do so until quite recently. We lived in Oakland in seasonless suspended animation, so these were year-round affairs. Nearly every neighbor, it turned out, nursed a secret love for poetry or could ghostly imitate Joni Mitchell. And among my mother's talents was the divination of other people's sometimes extremely latent skills. She would swan around these evenings in white linen, her blonde hair full of static, a Swisher Sweet wedged between two fingers, grape or cherry smoke trailing up from her nostrils. People laughed and applauded and smoked pot from metal folding or canvas sling chairs. Tree stumps served as drinks tables. And my little brother Andrew swooped in and out of the proceedings on the tire swing that dangled from the oak in our yard. I, in the years before I spent all my time away from the house, sat on the front porch of our three-story Victorian and watched a haze rise from the crowd, as if they were all producing their own heady perfume. This was Oakland in the 80s, so inevitably the evenings devolved into lamentations and excoriations, the perfidious war on drugs, the closure of department stores and manufacturing plants. This was in the hills behind Piedmont Avenue, and though not all our neighbors were white, they did all have college degrees, if not postgraduate ones. And like my mother, many of them worked in the helping professions. You got this, babe, Scotty said, taking my hand. Our Uber pulled away. Shapes stirred on the other side of the street, unhoused men encamped by the dry creek bed. The tire swing hovered in the moonlight, and the 580 hushed like the ocean. This is wrong, I said as we ascended to the porch. She didn't want us here. A man I didn't know opened the door, not an unusual occurrence at this household. A towering, beefy guy in a plastic checkered Campbell's soup apron and a tiny pink t-shirt he was in danger of bursting out of. This had to be Hector. Brianna, he said, and enfolded me. I was stunned by the cool, sticky aliveness of his exposed biceps. I'm so glad we could meet, he murmured in my ear, even under such circumstances. Then Andrew and Andrew's ex, Ben, had materialized and were dragging me, against my will it felt, into the house I'd grown up in. Instantly, I was assaulted by the smell of shea butter and incense, and by the rotted fruit smell of Andrew's drunkenness as he pulled me into a tight, nervous hug. In the last 30 seconds, I had been shepherded from one guy to another, and I wanted them all to stop fucking touching me. She's in complete denial, Andrew said. She tried to go to a community board meeting this afternoon, and she'd shuffled about halfway down the block before she stopped and bent over and clutched her stomach. We were all watching from the porch. Hector went and picked her up and carried her back. She's fucking insane. The city is trying to shut down NEATS, Hector said. He had a small, bubbly pit, a kind of burn on one cheek, and tattoos wreathing his arms. Claire is very passionate about saving it. Of course she was. NEATS was a filthy dump of a bar, a fulcrum of drugs and drive-by shootings, an ideal cause for my mother to champion. She's actually doing really well, Ben said. She's calm, she's brave. She doesn't exactly shrink from a fight, does she? Easy for you to say, Andrew said. You're an anthropologist here. You're a disinterested observer. You're Jane Goodall or whoever Sigourney Weaver played, and Bree and I are the fucking apes eating our own shit. Now he was crying. Ben commandeered his shoulders. Breathe, he said. Scotty chose then to set down the suitcases he'd been carrying. Andrew abruptly downshifted into Southern Belle. Well, hello there. I remember your face from the early days of the pandemic when Bree was feeling sentimental enough to get on Zoom with her baby bro. He whinnied a little as he shook Scotty's hand. Scotty was 12 years younger than me. Nice to meet you, man, he said again. That sounds good.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Um, so can you tell us where this story came from? Because I was, one of the things that I think is impressive about the story is all the moving pieces. There's a pretty large cast of characters for a short story, and the plot of the story is just lots happening. And I'm just curious. I'm curious how this story came about.
Well, I wrote the first draft quite a number of years ago, when I was still in a workshop. And it was one of those situations where I don't know if you are familiar with this, where, uh, in the fall, you're kind of like submitting the stuff that you worked on all summer. That's kind of like had you put some real time and thought into it, and then spring rolls around and you're just kind of like cranking it out, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it was like spring, and I had like a deadline coming up, and I had nothing in the tank, and so I wrote the first draft like very, very like a mad dash in a weekend or something. And I just say all that because I think that, well, one, I don't remember writing the first draft very clearly, but there was also just a kind of, I think part of the reason why it's such a big and dense story is I was just throwing everything that I had like without initially without a ton of conscious thought, I have to say. Um, and so I remember, let's see. Well, okay, so what I do remember about that first draft is I wanted to write. This was the first thing I ever wrote that's set in California. I'm from the East Coast, and I'd moved out to the Bay Area, and I live in SF now, but I was living in Oakland at the time, and I was living pretty much behind Piedmont Avenue, and I wanted to write something that was set in my neighborhood because there was just certain things about the vibe that I found interesting. Um, and then I was actually inspired by this Mary Gateskill story I was reading at the time, that was in her second collection because they wanted to. This story called Comfort, which is not one of her most famous or frankly even one of her best stories, but it was, sometimes like a certain piece will just get lodged in your head. And it's a story about a guy who who goes home when his mom is in a car accident. Like she has a very, very serious car accident, and he's sort of drawn back into his childhood and to, interacting with these people he left behind. And the opening scene is he's in San Francisco with his girlfriend, and he gets a phone call from his brother, and he's like, "Mom's in the hospital." It's like a very basic inciting incident, but for some reason I just thought, oh, I'll do that. I'll just have someone who's kind of put some distance between them and their family, and then they get sort of sucked back in because of a health crisis. Um, and I also, I think, wanted to write about, um, I wanted to write about, so there's the mother in the story. The narrator is this woman named Brianna. Her her younger brother is named Andrew, and their mother's named Claire. And, um, sort of the backstory of because the Brianna and Andrew are like in their 40s basically. Uh, but the backstory is that when they were young, their dad left pretty early on, and their mom just, you know, was this very progressive and socially conscious woman who worked as a social worker in the public school system, and she also just like allowed people to live in their house, and they had this constant sort of influx of people living on the third floor who had been recently released from prison, who were struggling with addiction, who were sex workers, who were maybe just down on their luck. And it was this very particular upbringing. And I never knew anyone who like really did that or had that experience. But I was interested in, I guess if you've read the story, it's not a spoiler to know that Claire appears to be, in the present moment of the story, when she's in her 70s, having a sexual relationship with one of the guys who's staying in her house, who's this recently released um, guy who just got out of prison named Hector, who we just met in that opening section. And so that I think was also one of the first things I knew is that I wanted to write about someone whose like activism kind of intersected with their sexuality in some way. Because I had seen versions of that in life in a few instances, and I thought that's an interesting situation. So it was like that plus health crisis. And then it was just like and it was just like and then I just wrote like 3 days. So it was just like blah, and it was a mess. But that was the genesis.
So, I'm interested then, like I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but so then if you had this draft that was, as you called it, a mess, and I can see how I can see how this early draft of the story would feel messy just because there are so many sort of disparate elements. What was the process then of bringing it to the story that we're reading here? Like what allowed you to sort of, or what guided you to the choices that you made, beyond that initial conception?
Well, so the initial draft, as I recall, actually focused more on the character of the mother, Claire.
Okay.
And it was really about the ways in which, and I think its story is still about that, but it was really about the ways in which both of her, middle-aged adult kids had sort of been warped by her influence. Because I think what's happened is that one of her children, Brianna, has created this estrangement from her family. She lives um, on the other side of the country. She works this very like bland, sort of intentionally like non-interesting job, and she dates this much younger man in this very sort of controlled and like I don't know. Like she's just very much in charge of her life, and she's not sort of giving in to any sort of like reckless or crazy impulses. And then her brother Andrew, who's a little bit younger, is like a dysfunctional mess, and he's also never really distanced himself from his mother at all, and he's still very much in her orbit. Anyway, so the first draft is really about the ways in which the mom had kind of fucked them both up. And uh, I think that one of the big comments I got from the writer Elizabeth Talent, who was the workshop leader when I worked on the story, um, was she said to me, I remember, like, "Oh, I don't really think this is like a mother-daughter story. I think it's a brother-sister story." And I think that was really, really true. And so a big part of the revision was kind of shifting the focus more toward the relationship between the siblings. And there's actually a line in the story which was not initially there. I mean, the first draft has very little resemblance to this. There's a line where they're in the hospital and her brother is in this like toxic relationship with a closeted married guy, and he's telling, and which was not in the first draft at all. The character of Simon was not in so that was a big addition. Um and he's telling her about this relationship, and it's like exhausting, right, to hear this messiness. And she thinks like maybe maybe what I'm most sort of dreading is not even my own mother's death, because the sort of jumping off point of the story is Claire is having surgery for cancer. Um, uh, she thinks that Brianna, the narrator, thinks maybe I'm not so much dreading my mother's death as I am dreading like Andrew becoming my responsibility,
Yeah.
because he has been, you know, glommed onto his mom for his entire adult life in this very like uh codependent way. And if mom's not there, who's going to take care of this, you know, mentally fragile middle-aged gay man who is her brother? And so something about that hinge, like that pivot from maybe what I'm really worried about is this prospect of taking care of my brother. Um, that was kind of like how I think started to figure the story out.
Well, it's really interesting too because there's, another sort of really significant layer to the story is the fact that one of Claire's former lovers slash boarders were not exactly, the because Brianna doesn't really know. She suspects Andrew has always claimed that he was, abused, or, it's complicated. Andrew's version of it is complicated. I think from the outside, we would say that he was molested or abused by this man. And there's always been this sort of tension between, like, do we believe that this happened to him, or is it part of his sort of, Andrew's kind of mental fragility that you mentioned? And that really hinges because then, like, the ending, like, they have this kind of heart to heart. Which, then sort of spurs, I think, their relationship, where they do like the big thing that they do, this sort of like horrible but amazing to watch on the page thing that they do to the Simon, the Andrew's sort of closeted boyfriend. They confront his wife, and it's just like it's one of those moments in the story where you're just like, I can't stop watching this. This is awful and terrible, and we all know this is not going to work, but we can't. I mean, even Brianna knows this is a bad idea, but it's this something about when they kind of really connect over the her finally kind of believing him about Walter. That's the thing that spurs this. I'm kind of curious how that all, if that was, I would doubt that you'd planned that because it doesn't read that way. I'm wondering kind of how you found your way to that. So both the story of Walter and abusing, molesting Andrew, and then how that led to the ending. If I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the very first draft, and this is the big change, right? The very first draft ended. So in the final version of the story, right, that's been published, it's this weird thing where it's a story, the story about this guy Walter, who was an alcoholic piano player who lived with them for a while when Andrew and Brianna were young, and who it appears, had a relationship with Andrew when he was a child, when he was um, significantly underage. It's this sort of it's like this family narrative that Brianna and Claire, the mom, just they kind of indulge it, but they don't seem to believe it, right? And it's just sort of been floating ambiently in their family lore for years. That's the way it's sort of iterated in the final draft. The first draft, it was not that, and in fact, the last scene of the first draft, uh, because again, it's mostly focused on the mom. Uh, Claire has come home from the hospital with her colostomy bag. I have no recollection of why I got interested in colostomy bags. That is that is a blur. Anyway, she's come home from the hospital, and and Andrew reveals this information for the first time in this extremely soap opera-ish way. He's like, "Guess what, Mom? 30 years ago, Walter molested," or like something ridiculous like that. And it was like curtain drop. It didn't work, right? It was a very clunky, very clunky scene. And so that was the other big change, honestly, in revision was a friend of mine who'd read the story said to me, like, first of all, why is he randomly confessing this right after his mom gets out of the hospital? Like, it doesn't seem very, very plausible. And also, it just sort of seems like the kind of thing that might be kind of part of the family lore, and it's something that they both believe and don't really look directly at, but are always just kind of deflecting. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. So turning that horribly melodramatic, last scene into backstory, basically, into something that was blurted out decades ago, and they've just kind of metabolized. That was the other big revision change. And so then, when I was rewriting the story, I workshopped the story. Like I said, I wrote it in a weekend. I workshopped it, and then I didn't look at it for like 2 years. And so a lot of time went by. I took it out of the closet, and I was starting to. That's when I felt like I really started to write it. Like after that, there was almost like that that initial free write version, and then I took it out years later and started to spend weeks and months on it. And And that's when I started to write about Simon and this other thing that was going on in Andrew's life. And yeah, I mean, tying all those threads together was definitely challenging. That was probably one of the big challenges of the story, is that at a certain point it was flailing in all these different directions. And the fact that, yeah, in the story now, Andrew says to Brianna, like, you need to do this for me to prove something. That definitely took like time to sort of figure that out. It was just. I think when it comes to, I've written a few stories like this that have like a lot of moving parts, and I think that the biggest challenge from like a craft perspective is like you want to you want to tie everything together. You don't want there to seem like there's anything arbitrary or random in the story, but you also, or at least I, don't want that tying together to feel too artificial or too contrived. And that can be a really delicate balance. And I think sometimes I feel like I've received feedback from readers of like later drafts being like, okay, but this thing that you mentioned on page 5 needs to come back, or you need to sort of tie this together or make that pay off. And sometimes I resist that because I feel like life is random and life is chaotic, but they're like, yeah, but if you're gonna spend a page talking about something, it needs to serve like a clear
Mhm.
narrative purpose. And so doing that, tying those things together in a way that feels uh real to me can be really hard.
Well, I mean, but it's like I think you'll understand when I say this. Like it's the story's messy. The story isn't messy. Like the story on the page is not messy, but the story of these people is messy,
For
right?
sure.
So the messiness, like we wouldn't believe it if it cleaned up at the end, right? If it did something that felt, we would be like, no, that these people are not capable right now of, X event that would kind of bring them all together in this sort of like happy, warm thing. So to me, the messiness of it, the messiness of these people's lives, yeah, I mean, I was really drawn to that. And like I said, I was drawn to the messiness of their lives while also as the reader or as a sort of writer reader being like, yeah, this is hard to do to have, a messy situation not feel messy on the page. For it to be have that feeling of authenticity where not everything gets solved, where certain threads don't necessarily come back, but yet still do the thing that we want from a story, right? Which is to leave us maybe not satisfied in a grand sense, but satisfied as a reader, right? That like Claire does this thing, right? Like it's I don't know if it's like her, she's guilty or she's sort of paying some penance or something where she's like, all right, well, this thing I'm gonna do with Andrew is terrible, but I owe him this, so she does it. And I think you know that's what matters, not what she does, right? It's that she does something, and then we just get to witness the train wreck of her confronting this woman in a grocery store parking lot, right?
Yeah,
um
I mean, I do think it's a gesture of love, right?
mhm.
I mean, it's a really weird gesture, and it's going to cause pain and wreak havoc on someone else's family, right? But that's like her, this is someone who has been so estranged from her own family because she finds them so um just draining and overwhelming and yet that, like, yeah, I think in my opinion, yeah, like the arc of the story is her reconnecting with her family and in this incredibly like weird and dysfunctional and potentially destructive way.
Yeah. I want to just ask one more question about the story too, because one of the other things I liked about the story, I mean, I liked everything about it, of course, but one of the other particular things was the dialogue, and the dialogue is wonderful, and of course, but I really like how there are times when these people are not like they're like in real life, like we're not always talking to someone, we're almost talking like at them. and we're not responding to them. And of course, we don't want to good dialogue is never like a clear back and forth. But there are moments in this story where that's really evident, where, and I think part of it comes from, um, you know, we have these siblings who, of course, have known each other for 40 years. So when they're communicating, we don't have access as readers to everything that they do, right? So when they're talking, they're I don't know, they just have this way of communicating that I was thought was really interesting. And I was just curious, I don't know what your thoughts were about how you approach writing the dialogue in this story, or dialogue in particular, if this is indicative of your typical sort of dialogue in your stories.
Well, yeah, I think that I think that this story did always kind of uh reveal itself as pretty dialogue driven. Not everything I think I write is like that, but some things are. Um, and I don't know why. But what I maybe should also say is that even though I mean, I wrote that very initial draft years past. I came back, and then it probably that second round, it was like working on it for about a year, off and on. Um, and a lot of time, a lot of time. But I would say that I wrote a lot of it still pretty quickly, like in kind of like fits and spurts. And I did with this story what I've done with a few stories, which I actually highly recommend as a revision process, which is just retyping from the beginning, just like uh opening a blank document and going from page one again, because I do like it. I do like when a story has that sense of like flow throughout, rather than, Frankensteining the pieces together. And I feel like that played a role somehow in the dialogue. Like I just felt like there was just a certain kind of, from like writing pretty quickly, there was a certain kind of momentum that gets going, and the characters are just sort of all squabbling with each other. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think that there's certain voices that come pretty naturally to me. Frankly, I think a voice like Andrew's, of like a dysfunctional alcoholic gay man, that voice is in my stable, um uh yeah, I mean, I remember that writing that he has like this long speech about his married lover, like in the middle of the story, and I just remember, like, you know it was there, you just hear the voice, right? It's in there. um yeah, I like stories that are dialogue driven, because it can kind of feel like the inmates are running the asylum, like the characters are kind of generating the story themselves. And I don't know, sometimes it can seem like the author is a little more invisible in that scenario, right? Because everyone's just like, I don't know, it's just sort of unfurling in the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you mentioned retyping from the beginning, because I literally had this conversation with another contributor, Andrea Saliki, just the other day, and she mentioned something similar, that when she says rewrite, she literally means rewriting the story completely. And I mentioned in that conversation that my dissertation director years ago, she would do that with novels, and it just blows my mind that she would literally retype the thing. And I've never tried it. I don't know why I haven't, but maybe I'll be convinced by the two of you to try this. But that's very cool. I think I can sort of see. I mean, I obviously see the benefit in that. But I think in particular, a story like this one, perhaps like having that kind of like really, because of the messiness of these people's lives, starting from the beginning again. I can see that helping keep those threads, like even just straight for you, right? Rather than having the parts and pieces, forgetting. I think I would probably lose track of where people are, and what has already happened in the story and what hasn't. So that's very cool. Um, so shifting gears a little bit, can you what were some books or writers that were really important to you starting out, and or ones that you come back to?
Well, I think that when I first was getting kind of serious about writing. Well, I mentioned Mary Gaitskill. That was a big one. I remember being in my 20s in New York and reading her stories. And I had this very clear memory of being on the subway and like, maybe you've had this experience with writers. Like suddenly I was like describing in my head the people on the subway at the way she would, like, because she has such a very unique way of describing people's physicality. And it was like that experience of seeing through someone else's eyes. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. She was a big one. Deborah Eisenberg also was a big and still is a big idol of mine. Someone who really is like a genius of dialogue, and she will, have a 10-page, dinner party conversation where everyone's looking at cross purposes. And I feel like there's a little bit of her influence on this. I mean, in my delusions, there's a little bit of her influence on this story. Um, she was a big one. Alan Hollinghurst, the novelist, was really impactful for me. It still is, but when I read The Line of Beauty when I was 24 or something, and I just yeah, I hadn't really read. I mean, I want to say I was very young at the time, but I feel like I hadn't really read a living writer that I thought was like that good, like that. I was a much snobbier reader when I was younger. I feel like as I've become a writer myself, I'm much more like tolerant and kind as a reader. But when I was young, I was, anyway. Um, but yeah, Alan Hollinger's Line of Beauty, Swimming Pool Library, Folding Star, all those books have been huge for me because, they talk about gay life and in this really granular and nuanced way. And um, yeah, David Wojnarowicz, his memoir, Close to the Knives. Um, what else? Uh, Shirley Hazard, uh, Penelope Fitzgerald, old British ladies. Well, Shirley Hazard's Australian. I'm sorry. Um, yeah,
All right,
yeah.
cool. Um, and then what about writers that, I mean, I think some of the ones you mentioned maybe are ones that are not read as widely as we would like them to be, of course. But what are some other writers that we should be reading?
Okay, well, I want to give a shout out to the writer Michael Diegler. He published a novel in stories 2 years ago called Early Sobrieties. It was published by Astra House, I believe. And it actually, I think it won a big first book prize, but I can't remember right now. Anyway, he's a really great writer. This book, Early Sobrieties, is it's kind of like a millennial Jesus' son. It's a novel in stories about a guy who has quit drinking, and it's like the first summer of sobriety. It takes place in Philadelphia, which is where I'm from, and is not as uh, documented a city in literature as it should be. And also more recently, after this book, Michael had a story in Harper's that Edward P. Jones chose for the O. Henry Prize that year, which I feel like if Edward P. Jones chose my story for an anthology, I would pretty much retire. And
Yeah, I think, yeah, you just quit.
like you can't really, it's like Meryl Streep giving you the Oscar or something. Um, anyway, he's Michael's a really amazing short story writer, and I actually think that one of the things I love, it's like very funny, very truthful, very like um like in touch with like working life and like people with real unglamorous jobs. But one of the things I really love about Michael's writing is that I think that he writes these really well-crafted short stories where in a way that I don't really know how to do, like in a way that like every element, every thread that gets introduced does connect and pay off, but it always feels so spontaneous while I'm reading it. Like it really feels like a jazz improvisation. Like I'm just following these people around on a few aimless days, and yet everything kind of lands in place in this way that does not feel contrived or stage managed. And I don't know how he does that. Because I feel like, frankly, with a lot of short story writers, I can sort of see the the pieces being moved into place, and I can hear the gears moving, and that's, that's fine. But like, yeah, it's just kind of a magic trick with him. It's amazing.
That's cool.
Um,
That's cool. That's not a book that at least I'm not. It's not ringing any bells unless maybe I saw a cover or something. That sounds like a fantastic collection. I'll have to check that one out for sure.
yeah.
I'm sort of embarrassed that I'm unaware of it. I hate that. So what, if you don't mind, what are you working on now, or what's next for you?
Well, I am trying to write a novel. And yeah, and that's that's hard. I it's about what should I say about it? It's about like a 30-year friendship between two queer men. It takes place in San Francisco, and hopefully it's kind of funny. Um uh yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's funny. I think when I started writing or trying to write a novel, I thought, because I'd written some stories like attachments that were kind of long and busy, and I thought, oh, it'll be easy to write a novel, because it's like I would often find myself trying to like shove too many things into a story. So I thought, oh, now I can just spread out, but it's it's not the same thing. But yeah, I been working on that for a few years.
I wondered if you were, because I was going to say something. Well, I don't know if I was going to say it or not, but I thought it for sure that this story kind of had a bigness to it. For you to say that if that's indicative of some of your other stories, I can see because it has a you know I don't want to say it has a novelistic scope because that's not right because it's still very contained, but it has just so many sort of moving parts and elements that it doesn't surprise me that you would lean toward a novel because that might be a place that you can stretch out a little bit. As difficult as that form is for story writers, I know. Um, well, that's awesome. it sounds. I wish you best of luck with that because I know that it's not always the easiest transition from short fiction to novels. Um, you can find attachments in the fall 2025 issue of SIR. You can go to usi.edu // SIR to find out how to get a copy. And a link will be below in the description. And thank you again, Mark. It was a pleasure chatting with you today.
Thank you for having me, Casey.
All right. See you later. Thanks.